I'll begin by recording. Okay, so now we're on record. Before I continue, I would like to know if I'm audible. So can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's fine.
Yes, sir.
So let me start by sharing my screen. So we're starting a bit late because my previous class ended late. We overflowed into our time. So I just ended on that class and then I logged on immediately. So now today we're looking at deductive reasoning. So welcome to the second half of the semester. The first half was a preparation. We were studying concepts in language and meaning. We studied statements that are not logical. Remember, we were discussing metaphors and proverbs. We saw meaning defects like vagueness, ambiguity, and all that. We also learned how to identify passages that are argumentative or not. Now it is time to study arguments. And I would like to say that this is the most challenging topic in this course. So I will advise you to listen very attentively. And I'll also try to download this topic as meticulously as possible. And I'll also ensure that you are moving along, as I'm also moving. So we'll take it one step at a time. Our different forms of reasoning. Arguments are also called reasoning or syllogism. So to argue is to reason. And another name for arguments is syllogisms in logic. So we'll be using the three terms, kind of interchangeably. Now there are two major categories of reasoning. We have deductive and inductive. Today we're looking at deductive reasoning. We also have causal reasoning, but it's a form of inductive reasoning. Now deductive reasoning, also called deductive argument or deductive syllogism. Now, this is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. Now, because of this, it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. It permits only one conclusion. Now, remember in mathematics, when you say 2 plus 2, there's only one conclusion, and it's 4. You can't say 2 plus 2 and you have 4 and another number. So deductive argument is sort of a mathematical argument. It's like a mathematical operation. That's why we say it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. A deductive argument does not make more than one conclusion possible. Otherwise, it will not be a valid deductive reasoning. For example, all men are mortal. Kofi is a man, therefore Kofi is mortal. Now, if you say all men are mortal, and you also say Kofi is a man, you have no choice but to say that Kofi is mortal. You cannot change the conclusion. You can't place the conclusion with another conclusion. You cannot, for instance, say Kofi is immortal or a fire cabinet is mortal. Okay. So before we start to look at this kind of argument, I want us to look at two parts of a sentence in an argument. In our English class, we study subject. Yeah, Angelina, you need to put off your mic. Two parts of a sentence, like the subject and the predicate. We have the reference class, which is like the subject. We have the attribute class, which is like the predicate. For example, all men are mortal. When you look at the statement, all men are mortal, the subject, all men, is the reference class. The predicate, are mortal, is the attribute class. The reference class is that to which the sentence refers, whilst the attribute class is that part of the sentence that is attributing something to or saying something about the reference class. Now we have finite and infinite reference classes. So now we want to look at reference class. There are two kinds of reference classes. We have the finite and infinite reference classes. The infinite reference class refers to all members or no members of a class, either 100% or 0. So we're saying that the infinite reference class refers to all members or no members of a class, either everyone or no one. For example, all men, no man, any man. The infinite reference class contains uncountable items. It contains uncountable items. You cannot count the items in the infinite reference class. You cannot count all men. You cannot count any man. And usually it is either everyone or no one. On the other hand, the finite reference class refers to countable and particular members of a class. Anything between 0% and 100% is countable. For example, some men. Some men are countable. 80% of men are countable. 5 men are countable. 1 man is countable. All the men is countable. Now remember that all the men is different from all men. All the men would be all the men in a particular context. All the men in this class, all the men in this town, all the men in this university. You can count them, but you cannot count all men. You can also count few men. You can also count almost all the men. Okay. So we have the finite and infinite reference classes. The finite reference class is the class of countable items. The infinite reference class is the class of uncountable items. Then you have universal and particular statements. Statements containing infinite reference class are called universal statements, whilst those containing finite reference classes are called particular statements. Example of universal statements, all men are mortal. Example of particular statements, some men drink alcohol. So the universal statements contain the infinite reference class. The particular statements contain the finite reference class or the countable reference class. A little exercise. Which statements are universal and which ones are particular? Number 1, this table is three-legged. Can anyone answer that?
Say particular.
Okay, number 2, tables can be sat on.
Say universal.
Okay, number 3, James and Mary passed the examination.
Particular.
Particular.
Number 4, all visitors should be treated with respect. Universal.
Universal.
Okay, that's good. So now let's look at validity. So the issue of validity is very important. So validity is the center of deductive reasoning. So what is validity? An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. Now we said that in a deductive argument, the premises make the conclusion necessary. If you look at this argument, all men are mortal, Kofi is a man. Do they make the conclusion necessary?
Yes.
Yeah, so, and then the conclusion follows with certainty. And that is why you cannot avoid the conclusion. It is also why there's only one possible conclusion. It is also why you cannot change the conclusion. So that is how you know a valid argument. The premises make the conclusion necessary, and the conclusion follows with certainty. That is the criterion for validity. Okay. So we said the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. All valid arguments are deductive arguments. Inductive arguments are strictly not valid. So we're talking about a purely mathematical argument where the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is logical. Now let's compare it to an inductive argument. 95% of men are honest. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is honest. Now in this argument, now this is an inductive, in this argument, do the premises make the conclusion necessary?
No, please.
No.
Okay, so
Yes, sir.
okay, so why is the conclusion not necessary?
Because it says 95% of men.
Yeah, so that means Peter can be among the 5% that are dishonest.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so that means that more than one conclusion is possible. Possible conclusion 1 will be Peter is honest. Possible conclusion 2 will be Peter is not honest. So the conclusion does not follow with certainty. That means it is not a valid argument. It is an inductive argument. Okay, now we begin the more engaging technicality. Now this is the second but last technicality we use for deductive reasoning. We are talking about the if and then conditional. Just give me a second. Okay, so we're talking about the if and then conditional. Now we're familiar with conditional statements, statements that contain if and then. If I'm hungry, then I'll eat. If the government doesn't pay us very well, then I'll go into business. If the university closes, then I'll go home. If this, then this. If that, then that. You know. Now, if then statements are called conditional statements. They are conditional statements because the if is a condition for the then. So the if part of the statement sets a condition, and then the then part of the statement says what will happen if the condition is met. Now we're saying that in deductive reasoning, we normally convert arguments into conditionals. Sometimes you need to convert a categorical statement into a conditional statement so that you can see what the statement is really saying. Now look at this categorical statement, all men are mortal. Convert it to a conditional statement. A statement that says if this, then that. So all men are mortal. As a conditional statement, it will be if something is a man, then it is mortal. So we can change the categorical statement of premise 1 to conditional statement. If something is a man, then it is mortal. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. Now, changing the premise 1 of an argument to a conditional statement helps you to see the argument more clearly. It helps you to see the direction of the argument more clearly. And in fact, how do we change arguments to conditional versions? If you go back to our old arguments, all men are mortal, Kofi is a man, Kofi is mortal. Which of the statements do you change to a conditional statement? You look at the two premises. Which premise do you have to change to a conditional premise? And why is it that statement?
Say please the premise 2.
No, premise 1.
Okay, so if you look at the two premises, you see that premise 1, the premise 1 is like an argument in itself. You will notice that premise 1 is more like an argument in itself, but premise 2 is a direct report. Azumatete Kate. Kate Azumatete, you have to put off your mic. If you look at premises 1 and 2, you will see that premise 1 is more like an argument, all men are mortal. But premise 2 is a direct report, like a factual statement, Kofi is a man. So it is that premise that is making more of an argument that you can convert into a conditional. Because if you say all men are mortal, then you can say if something is a man, then it is mortal. But you cannot convert premise 2 into a conditional, because the premise 2 is just a direct report that this person is a man. Now, because of that, I normally call premise 1 the major premise.
At the time you call.
Geoffrey Aqua.
Geoffrey
Aqua, your microphone is on. Geoffrey Aqua, I'm wondering why you put on your microphone. Unless you needed to speak. So that premise that you can convert to a conditional, I call it the major premise. The major premise. So when you come to an argument, first of all, you need to identify which one is the major premise, and then you can convert it to a conditional. And that is also the premise that you use to begin your calculations. All your calculations will start from the major premise of an argument. From there, you calculate down to the other premise and down to the conclusion. Sometimes the major premise can be premise 2 instead of premise 1. It doesn't matter the position. Okay, so let's go back to where we stopped. So if we change the major premise to a conditional statement, we will say if something is a man, then it is mortal. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. So it helps us to see the argument clearly. Sometimes we need to convert some arguments to their conditional version so that we see what the argument is really doing. I'm sure you'll see more of that later. Then another thing is to convert arguments into their symbolic versions. That is, to convert the words into symbols. All men are mortal, Peter is a man, Peter is mortal. you see that there are three terms in this argument, or there are three concepts. Number one, you have men or man, then you have mortal, and then you have someone's name, Peter. So you have three terms or three concepts. So you can replace each of the terms with a symbol. You can say man is A, mortal is B, Peter is X. So to represent the argument in symbolic form, you say all men are mortal, all A's are B's. Peter is a man, X is an A. Peter is mortal, X is a B. So all A's are B's, X is an A, X is a B. For the conditional version, if something is a man, then it is mortal. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. If A, then B. X is an A, therefore X is a B. If A, then B, X is an A, therefore X is a B. Sometimes we just remove the X's and just say A and B. If A, then B. A, therefore B. Now, so this is the last technicality we need to know, because this is the technicality we use to do deductive reasoning, to identify kinds of deductive arguments, the antecedents and the consequence. Now, whenever you look at a major premise, I told you how to identify what I call a major premise. Whenever you look at a major premise, the first part of the premise, the reference class, is normally the antecedent. And the second part of the sentence, which is the attribute class or the predicate, is normally called the consequent. So the subject of the sentence or the reference class, is normally the antecedent, and the predicate of the sentence or the attribute of the sentence is normally called the consequent. So whether you convert it, whether it is the major premise is in categorical form or it is in conditional form, the first part is the antecedent, the second part is the consequent. Even if you converted it to conditional, the part that starts with if, which is the first part, is the antecedent. And then the part that starts with then, which is the second part, is the consequent. Now, antecedent means whatever comes before, and consequent means whatever comes after. Now let's read this. Recall the reference class and the attribute class. So, and then also recall our treatment of conditionals. Now, if we restate any categorical proposition as a conditional statement, the reference class becomes the antecedent and the attribute class becomes the consequent. So whether the argument is in categorical or conditional form, whether the statement is in categorical or conditional form, the first part is the antecedent, the second part is the consequent. Example, all A are B, or if A then B. The reference class, in this case A, is the antecedent, and the attribute class, in this case B, is the consequent. A is the antecedent and B is the consequent. So any statement referring to A will be either affirming or denying the antecedent. And any statement referring to B will be either affirming or denying the consequent. Example, X is an A, affirms the antecedent. Remember, the major premise is all A are B, or all A's are B's. If you say X is an A, it affirms the antecedent. If you say X is not an A, it denies the antecedent. If you say X is a B, it affirms the consequent. If you say X is not a B, it denies the consequent. Now let's put it in practicals. All A's are B's, X is an A. That affirms the antecedent. Therefore, X is a B is the conclusion. So you will see that the second premise is affirming the antecedent. Because of that, we say that the whole argument affirms the antecedent, or it is an argument that affirms the antecedent. Then look at denying the antecedent. All A's are B's, X is not an A. That denies the antecedent. So because the second premise is denying the antecedent, we say that the whole argument is denying the antecedent, or it is an argument that denies the antecedent. Affirming the consequent. All A's are B's, X is a B. Now you can see that the second premise is affirming the consequent. So because the second premise is affirming the consequent, we say that the whole argument affirms the consequent, or it is an argument that affirms the consequent. Denying the consequent. All A's are B's, X is not a B. So the second premise denies the consequent. Now, because the second premise is denying the consequent, we say that the whole argument is denying the consequent, or it is an argument that denies the consequent. Now, this is the rule for deductive reasoning. We only affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. Any other operation would make the argument lose its validity. We only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. So that means that out of the four operations we just saw, out of the four arguments we just saw, it means that it is only the one that affirms the antecedent and the one that denies the consequent that are valid arguments. The other two are invalid. So now this one affirms the antecedent. All A's are B's, X is an A, therefore X is a B. This is an argument that affirms the antecedent, so it is valid. But the one that denies the antecedent, X is not an A, X is not a B, is invalid. Then the argument that affirms the consequent, X is a B, therefore X is an A, is invalid, is not valid. The one that denies the consequent, X is not a B, therefore X is not an A, is invalid. Now let us find out why Juliet Mifetu. Juliet Mifetu. You need to put off your mic. Okay, so let's find out why it is so. Now let's look at these examples. All A's are B's. X is an A, which affirms the antecedent. So X is a B. We say this is a valid argument because it affirms the antecedent. Now let's look at the example. Convert it to words. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian, which affirms the antecedent. So Peter is an African. So we say this is a valid argument. Why is it a valid argument? We said all Ghanaians are Africans. And then Peter is a Ghanaian. So Peter is an African. Now, let's look at why the argument is valid. If all Ghanaians are Africans, if every Ghanaian is an African, and then you say Peter is a Ghanaian, then it means Peter must be an African. So that is why the argument is valid. Now let's look at the illustration. We have two boxes. We have a bigger box called Africans. We have a smaller box called Ghanaians. Now the smaller box is in the bigger box. We said that everyone who belongs to the smaller box is automatically in the bigger box. If you say that Peter belongs to the smaller box, doesn't it mean that Peter is in the bigger box? So that is why we say it is a valid argument. Any argument that affirms the antecedent is a valid argument. Why? Because the consequent is normally a larger class of items compared to the antecedent. The consequent is always a larger class of items compared to the antecedent. So if you say all A's are B's, B's is a larger class of items compared to A. If you say all A's are B's, it means that B accommodates A, and B can also accommodate more. Now, if you say all A's are B's, it doesn't mean that all B's are A's. If you say all A's are B's, the logical implication is that B can accommodate A, and B can also accommodate more. Who is this? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the consequent is normally a larger class of items compared to the antecedent. Whenever you say that all A's are B's, it implies that B's is a logically larger class of items compared to A. Now let's go back to the technicality. That is why we say that if all Ghanaians are Africans and Peter is a Ghanaian, then Peter must definitely be an African. That is why it is a valid argument. An argument that affirms the antecedent is a valid argument because the consequent is normally a larger class of items compared to the antecedent. Now let's do the opposite. Let's try to deny the antecedent. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian. But let's begin with the symbols. At the end of the slide, all A's are B's. X is not an A, which denies the antecedent. Therefore, X is not a B. We said it's not a valid argument. Now let's look at it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian. That denies the antecedent. Therefore, Peter is not an African. We said it is not valid. Now, why is this argument not valid? We have to go back to the box again. We have the bigger box Africans, we have the smaller box Ghanaians. Now, if you say all Ghanaians are Africans, and you say Peter is not a Ghanaian, therefore he's not an African, is it a valid argument?
Yes, please.
Can you say that Peter is not an African because he's not a Ghanaian?
Yes.
Let me repeat the question. Can you say that Peter is not an African because he's not a Ghanaian?
No, you can't say that, sir.
Okay, so why? Why is it not a valid argument?
Because not only Ghanaians are African.
Okay, so not only Ghanaians are Africans, you also have other nationalities that are Africans.
Yes, please.
Okay. So all Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is not an African. The argument is not valid. The conclusion doesn't follow with certainty because you don't know whether Peter is another African nationality, maybe a South African, a Cameroonian, a Togolese, or some other African nationality. So you cannot deny that Peter is an African by simply denying that he's a Ghanaian. That is why an argument that denies the antecedent is an invalid argument. Any argument that denies the antecedent is invalid. So let's go back. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian. Therefore, Peter is not an African. We said it's not a valid argument. So we have seen two kinds of arguments. The one that affirms the antecedent is a valid argument. The one that denies the antecedent is not a valid argument. Now let's look at those that affirm or deny the consequent. Let's go back to the box. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is an African. So that affirms the consequent. Peter is an African. Therefore, Peter is a Ghanaian. Can you say that Peter is a Ghanaian because Peter is an African?
No.
So why?
Because not all Africans are Ghanaians.
Okay, so that's correct. You cannot prove that Peter is a Ghanaian by simply saying that he's an African. So all Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is an African. Therefore, Peter is a Ghanaian. It is an argument that affirms the consequent. So any argument that affirms the consequent is not valid. If you try to affirm the consequent in order to reach a conclusion, that will be an invalid argument. Now let's try to deny the consequent. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not an African. Therefore, Peter is not a Ghanaian. Can you prove that Peter is not a Ghanaian by proving that he's not an African?
Yes.
Okay. So that means that any argument that denies the consequent is a valid argument. Any argument that denies the consequent in order to reach a conclusion is a valid argument. That is why we said that according to the rule for deductive reasoning, now look at the rule for deductive reasoning. We only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. Any other operation would make the argument lose its validity. So the argument that affirms the antecedent is valid. The one that denies the antecedent is not valid. The argument that affirms the consequent is not valid. The one that denies the consequent is valid. So based on that, let's look at the four kinds of, those ones that are valid. Those ones that are valid have names. The one that affirms the antecedent is valid. We call it modus ponens. Any argument that affirms the antecedent, we call it modus ponens. It's a valid argument. And any argument that denies the consequent, any argument that denies the consequent, we call it modus tollens because it's a valid argument, modus tollens. Then the other two are fallacies. The one that denies the antecedent is a fallacy of denying the antecedent. The one that affirms the consequent is a fallacy of affirming the consequent. Now let's look at it here. Sorry. So four kinds of deductive arguments. So modus ponens is an argument that affirms the antecedent. All A's are B's, X is an A, X is a B. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian. Peter is an African. So we said it's a valid argument. We call it modus ponens. Then we have the fallacy of modus ponens, the fallacy of denying the antecedent. All A's are B's, X is not an A, S is not a B. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian. Sorry, all Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian. Therefore, Peter is not an African. We said it is not valid. We call it the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Then we have modus tollens. All A are B, X is not a B, therefore X is not an A. We said this is a valid argument. All Ghanaians are Africans. Michael is not an African, therefore Michael is not a Ghanaian. We said it's a valid argument. We call it modus tollens. Then we have the fallacy of modus tollens, the fallacy of affirming the consequent. All A are B, X is a B, therefore X is an A. All Ghanaians are Africans. George is an African, therefore George is a Ghanaian. So we said it is invalid. We call it the fallacy of affirming the antecedent. Okay, so let's look at another example of modus ponens. All those studying in the Department of Physics are enrolled at University of Ghana. Kelvin is not enrolled at University of Ghana. So Kelvin is not studying in the Department of Physics. Let's assume that there's a debate about whether Kelvin is studying in the Department of Physics or not. Some people are saying Kelvin is studying in the Department of Physics. Some people are saying Kelvin is not studying in the Department of Physics. And then someone goes to the registry and goes to the registrar to find out if Kelvin is enrolled at the University of Ghana. And then the registrar writes and announces that Kelvin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana. So what happens to this debate? If Kelvin is not enrolled at University of Ghana, can Kelvin be in the Department of Physics?
No.
Okay, so now let's begin by finding out what kind of argument is this. Now, what type of argument is this? First of all, you have to find out the major premise. What is the major premise? And when you come to the major premise, you have to find out the antecedent and the consequent. So what's the major premise and what's the antecedent and the consequent? Okay, so Tete.
Sir, please, I'm not clear with the question. That's why I raised my hand. I'm not clear with the question. Sorry.
Okay, but okay, you raised your hand.
Yes, please. I wasn't clear with the question. That's why I raised my hand.
Okay, so now what kind of argument is this?
Sir, please. Actually, I just joined, so can you please go?
Okay, that's fine. So you can raise down your hand.
Okay, sir.
So I was saying that in order to find out what kind of argument is this, first of all, you need to find the major premise. What's the major premise? The major premise is the one that is looking more like an argument in itself. So look at it. Kevin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana. That's not really like an argument. It's like a direct report, a direct factual report. Now, the other one, all those studying in the Department of Physics are enrolled at the University of Ghana. So that looks a bit more complicated than the other premise. So that is the major premise. And that means that the antecedent is all those studying in the Department of Physics. The consequent is enrolled at University of Ghana. Then what is the second premise doing? Kevin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana. The second premise is denying the consequent. So because of that, it is an argument that denies the consequent. Denying the consequent is a modus tollens. So it is a valid argument. Okay. So let's move on. Now let's look at another form of the fallacy of modus tollens. All A are not B. X is not a B. Therefore, X is an A. Is this an argument that affirms the consequent, or is it an argument that denies the consequent?
Affirms the consequent.
Affirms the consequent. So why do you say it affirms the consequent?
Because they're saying the major thing is all A are not B. So if all A are not B, then X, if X is not B, then it's agreeing with the major.
Okay, yeah, so that's correct. So that's correct. If you say all A are not B, and you say X is not a B, the second premise is agreeing with the first one. So it's an affirmation. It's not a denial. So it is an argument that affirms the consequent. Whenever you have two negatives from your mathematics, whenever you have two negatives, then you have a positive. Whenever you have two negatives, you have a positive. The first premise is negative about B. The second premise is negative about B. So it means that the second one is affirming the first one. One negative is affirming the other. So it's an affirmation. And any argument that affirms the consequent is invalid. So this is an invalid argument. Now let's put it in words. All human beings are not goats. X is not a goat. Therefore, X is a human being. So we said this is an argument that affirms the consequent rather than deny the consequent. If it affirms the consequent, it means the argument is invalid. So can someone explain why this argument is invalid? By looking properly at the argument. Okay, so let me answer that. Now, it is true that all human beings are not goats. That is true. So if X is not a goat, does it mean that X is a human being? And we don't know what X is. Yeah, so granted that all human beings are not goats, if we say that X is not a goat, does it mean that X is a human being?
No, sir.
Yeah, so X not being a goat does not mean that it must be a human being. It could be another animal. Maybe it's a tiger or a dog or something, or a snake. So that's why we say that any argument that affirms the consequent is invalid. An argument that affirms the consequent can never be valid once you are able to determine that it affirms the consequent. So again, not being a goat is a logically larger category than all human beings. I told you that the consequent is usually a larger category than the antecedent. So the fact that X is not a goat does not necessarily make X a human being. X could as well be a cat or a tiger. So that rounds up our treatment of modus ponens and tollens and then their fallacies. Now, so modus ponens is a valid argument. Modus tollens is a valid argument. The other two are invalid. Denying the antecedent is invalid. Affirming the consequent is invalid. Now, so that means we have seen two valid types of deductive arguments. Now, let's look at the third kind of valid deductive argument. We call it hypothetical syllogism. This is an argument where the consequent of an initial or first premise becomes the antecedent of a second or subsequent premise. That is, the consequent of a premise becomes the antecedent of the next premise. The consequent of a premise becomes the antecedent of the next premise. Look at this example. All A are B, all B are C. You see that the consequent of the first premise has become the antecedent of the next premise. So the consequent of the first premise is B, and then B becomes the antecedent of the next premise. That is how you know a hypothetical syllogism. All A are B, all B are C. And then the consequent of the second premise, which is C, can become the antecedent of a third premise. And so a third premise will be all C are D. And then you can even have a fifth premise, all D are E, all E are F, all F are G, all G are H, and so on. It can go down to Z. And then the conclusion, what does the conclusion do? The conclusion pairs the very first antecedent with the very last consequent. So you can see this. Look at this, the last two sentences. The last two sentences. The conclusion pairs the very first antecedent with the very last consequent. So you can see the conclusion. It pairs the very first consequent, it pairs the very first antecedent with the very last consequent. So it says, therefore, all A are C. If it is an argument that began from A to Z, the conclusion will be, therefore, all A are Z. That's how you know a hypothetical syllogism. Let's put it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Africans are human beings. Therefore, all Ghanaians are human beings. All A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. You can extend this argument. You can say all Ghanaians are Africans. That is, you can extend this argument by adding more premises. You can say all Ghanaians are Africans, all Africans are human beings, all human beings are creatures of God, all creatures of God will be forgiven on the last day. All those who are forgiven on the last day will go to heaven. Therefore, all Ghanaians will go to heaven. So that's a hypothetical syllogism. Okay, so let's explain it. We notice that the consequent of the first premise, which is B, becomes the antecedent of the second premise. And then the antecedent of the second premise, which is the consequent of the first premise, leads us to a new party, which is C, as the consequent. So it just continues like that. Any additional subsequent premise will typically feature the consequent of its predecessor as its antecedent, so that it is linked conditionally to a fresh party. Now, so that's the nature of hypothetical syllogisms. Now let's look at two fallacies of hypothetical syllogism, or we call it two hypothetical fallacies. The first fallacy: all A are B, all B are C, therefore all C are A. What went wrong in this argument? What is different between this argument and the hypothetical syllogism? Yeah, Sylvester, go ahead.
So when you look at the second step for OCR, is the consequence of the second premise. And
Okay, that's good. Okay, that's fine. So you see that the conclusion reversed the last premise, the last consequence, and the first antecedent. The conclusion placed the last consequence before the first antecedent instead of vice versa. So instead of saying all, therefore all A are C, it said all C are A. So that's a fallacy. Now let's put it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans. All Africans are human beings. Therefore, all human beings are Ghanaians. So you can see it's a fallacy. Now let's look at the second hypothetical fallacy. All A are C. Now this one jumped. Instead of saying all A are B, it said all A are C, all B are C. Therefore, all A are B. So we're saying this is a fallacy. Let's put it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Kenyans are Africans, therefore all Ghanaians are Kenyans. So you can see it's a fallacy. Sometimes it can be true by accident, but that doesn't mean that it is true by design. All Ghanaians are human beings, all Africans are human beings, therefore all Ghanaians are Africans. Yes, it is true that all Ghanaians are Africans, but you didn't find out the truth of the conclusion from the argument. The argument cannot give you the truth of the conclusion. You know the truth of the conclusion from outside the argument. You cannot find out the truth of the conclusion from the argument itself. So the conclusion is true by accident, but the argument itself is invalid. So that's that about hypothetical syllogism. Now let's look at disjunctive syllogism, which is the last kind of deductive argument. This is a syllogism where the main premise is a disjunctive, either or. When we affirm something of any of the disjunctive items, then we have automatically denied it the other disjunctive part. So if a statement is either or, if you take one, then you have rejected the other one. Any one of the disjuncts you take implies the rejection of the other one. Example, either A is true or B is true. A is true, so B is false. Or either A is true or B is true. B is true, so A is false. Put it in words, either I became a reverend father or I got married. I got married, so I did not become a reverend father. Or either I became a reverend father or I got married. I became a reverend father, so I did not get married. So this is a disjunctive syllogism. So a little exercise. Determine what kind of argument this is. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Today he passed by my mother's house, so he went to town. What kind of argument is this? We have seen modus ponens, fallacy of modus ponens, modus tollens, fallacy of modus tollens. We've seen hypothetical syllogism. We've seen two hypothetical fallacies, and we've seen disjunctive syllogism. So what kind of argument is this? How do you begin to find out what kind of argument is this? What is the first step to take? The first step to take is to identify the major premise. What is the major premise? And if you've identified the major premise, then what is the antecedent and what is the consequent? Then you can know whether the argument affirms or denies the antecedent or affirms or denies the consequent. If it is not doing any of the four of them, then you ask yourself whether it's a hypothetical argument or even whether it is a disjunctive argument. Okay, so the first thing, what is the major premise? Is it anytime he goes to town, or is it today he passed by my mother's house?
Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house.
Okay, so what is the antecedent and what is the consequent?
Sir,
Anytime
please,
he
the
goes to
antecedent.
town is the antecedent.
And then the consequent?
Passes by my mother's house.
Yeah.
Okay. So is it an argument that affirms or denies the antecedent, or it affirms or denies the consequent? What is the second premise doing?
So it affirms the antecedent.
Affirms the antecedent. What is the antecedent?
Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house.
And you
No,
said,
it's just anytime he goes to town. The antecedent.
okay, so what is the second premise doing?
It affirms the antecedent
affirming the-
anytime he goes to town.
It is affirming what?
The antecedent anytime he goes to town.
What is the second premise?
He passes
Today
by
he
my
passed
mother's
by,
house.
he passed by my mother's house.
And you said it's affirming the antecedent?
The consequence.
Is it affirming or denying the consequent?
So it's denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent.
No, it cannot be doing both.
Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house.
So
it's affirming the consequence.
it is affirming the consequent.
Yes,
Yes.
it is affirming the consequence and denying the antecedent.
No, it can't be both.
Okay, so it is affirming the consequent. Is it a valid argument?
No, it's invalid.
Okay.
It's invalid. It's an invalid argument. Yeah.
Okay, so can you tell me why it is invalid?
Sir,
Because
because
the fact that he didn't. Okay.
to my sir, because he might pass by, but not necessarily going to town.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he might pass by my mother's house without going to town.
Yes, please.
Yes, so he can pass by my mother's house and enter the next house.
The next house. Exactly. Sir.
All right, so that shows you that anytime you try to affirm the consequent, it can never be a valid argument.
Okay.
Sir, please come again.
Anytime you try to affirm the consequent, the argument can never be valid.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You cannot try to reach a conclusion by affirming the consequent, because when you affirm the consequent, the argument to be porous. The argument to be porous. You can see that saying that he went to town because he passed by my mother's house, it's a porous argument. You can't succeed with it. Now answer correctly. We deduce correctly when we deny the antecedent, true or false? When we deny the antecedent, do we deduce correctly? We said that denying the antecedent is invalid, so it is false.
Yeah, false.
Number two, we deduce correctly when we affirm the antecedent, true or false?
True.
True.
Number three, we deduce correctly when we deny the consequent, true or false?
True.
Number four, we deduce correctly when we affirm the consequent, true or false?
False.
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 Okay. Just a second. Okay, so let's look at validity versus soundness. So we've been talking about validity all this while. We've seen what is valid and what is not valid. Now let's compare it to soundness. Now the four types of deductive syllogism are four ways of making deductively valid arguments. So modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, disjunctive syllogism. There are four ways of making deductively valid arguments. A valid argument is an argument whose premises are logically consistent with its conclusion. The premises of a valid argument necessarily imply its conclusion in the manner that it is impossible to deny the inference without running into self-contradiction. So you cannot deny a valid deductive argument unless you want to contradict yourself. An invalid argument is an argument whose premises do not logically imply the conclusion. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not that of logical necessity. So the premises don't make the conclusion logically necessary. You can proceed to deny the conclusion of an invalid argument without contradicting yourself. So if someone says that Peter is an African, therefore Peter is a Ghanaian, you can deny it without contradicting yourself. The argument of affirming the consequent. If someone says Peter is an African, therefore Peter is a Ghanaian, you can deny it without contradicting yourself. You can say, yes, he's an African, but he's not a Ghanaian. He is a Togolese, or he's a Nigerian, or he's a Ugandan. Now, the fallacies we have seen, the fallacy of modus ponens, fallacy of modus tollens, sorry, the fallacy of denying the antecedent, the fallacy of affirming the consequent, the two hypothetical fallacies, we call them formal fallacies. The fallacies in deductive reasoning are called formal fallacies because we have informal fallacies. We'll be discussing informal fallacies by upper week. So you can compare the informal fallacies to the formal fallacies. The formal fallacies are the fallacies committed, the bad forms of deductive reasoning. But the informal fallacies are something else. Now we have valid but not sound. An argument can be valid, but it is not sound. Look at this argument. All human beings are immortal. Peter is a human being. Therefore, Peter is immortal. Is it a valid argument?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Why is
sir.
it, why
It's
is
a
it
valid
valid?
argument.
It's valid because the premise one says all human beings are immortal, and Peter too belongs to the human beings.
Okay, so it is an argument that affirms the antecedent. Any argument that
Yes,
affirms
please.
the antecedent is a valid argument.
Yes, sir.
But is the argument true?
Yes, please. That is
The
true.
argument is not true
The argument is not true. Peter is not immortal.
because human beings are immortal. Are mortal, sorry.
Yeah, so the argument is valid, but it is not true.
Yes, yeah.
Any argument that is not true, any argument that is valid but is not true, is not a sound argument. The argument is unsound. So it is valid because it is a correct modus ponens, but it is not sound because one of the premises is not true. This is another example. All men are mammals, all mammals must get killed, therefore all men must get killed. First of all, what kind of argument is this? Is it modus ponens, tollens, hypothetical, or disjunctive? Or one of the fallacies? Let's convert it to a symbolic argument. Let's convert the words to symbols. So men is A, mammals is B, and then what is the third concept? The third concept is getting killed. So getting killed is C.
N is A.
So all men are
Mammals is
B,
B.
all A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. What is the kind of argument?
So it's the fallacy of modus.
All A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C.
So I think it's the fallacy of modus.
No, it's a hypothetical argument.
Okay.
All A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. An argument where the consequent of a premise becomes the antecedent of the next premise. And then the conclusion pairs the very first antecedent to the very last consequent. So that's hypothetical argument. Now, so it means it is a valid argument. A hypothetical argument is a valid argument. But is the argument true?
So it's not true. The argument is not true.
Yeah, so the argument is not true. It's not true that all men must get killed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so why is it not true? It is not true because there is a false information somewhere. The false information is where? All men are mammals, that is correct. All mammals must get killed, that's wrong. So the false information is in premise 2. And
Premise
then,
2.
and then from premise 2, it got into the conclusion. So the argument is valid but not sound. Then we can have invalid argument with true conclusion. Invalid argument but with a true conclusion. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization because citizens in a democracy are holier than citizens in another form of political organization. This is a single sentence argument. So the argument is all in one sentence. One part of the sentence is the conclusion, the other part is the premise. Now, where is the conclusion and where is the premise? Which one is the conclusion? The conclusion comes first. And remember that conclusions can come first. The conclusions don't always come last. So in this case, the conclusion comes first. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization. That is the conclusion. And then the premise is because citizens in a democracy are holier than citizens in another form of political organization. So we have conclusion before premise. Now, the conclusion is, we normally regard the conclusion as true. So democracy is better than other forms of political organization. I think most people regard it as true. But is it true because of the premises?
Sir, please.
Is
the question again.
Is the conclusion true because of the premises?
No.
No, sir.
Okay, so the conclusion is not true because of the premises. Juliet, your microphone is on. Okay, wait. Okay, so let me mute everyone, and then I will. So it is not because citizens in a democracy are holier that we consider a democracy better. Democracy is better for another reason. So this is an invalid argument with a true conclusion. An invalid argument with a true conclusion. And look at the bottom of the slide. True conclusion alone does not make an invalid argument correct. So you get a lot of arguments like this. And if you're not a logician, you might be forced to accept them. You can get invalid arguments with true conclusion. In fact, in real life, there are a lot of arguments that are invalid, but their conclusions are true. So you need to point out that the conclusion is true, but the argument itself is invalid. And a true conclusion cannot make an invalid argument correct. Then we have valid and sound. Valid and sound. To be sound, all the premises in a valid argument must be true. All men are mortal. Peter is a man. Peter is mortal. Everything here is true. So the argument is valid. It is an argument that affirms the antecedent. So it is a valid modus ponens. And then all the information is correct. So everything is true. So the argument is valid and sound. So we can have three forms. We can have valid and sound, valid and unsound, invalid and unsound. So another example of valid and sound, we have all snakes are reptiles, that is true. Cobra is a snake, that is true. Therefore, cobra is a reptile. That's also true. So everything here is true. Now, what kind of argument is this? Cobra is a snake. So it is an argument that affirms.
Valid.
It's an argument that affirms the antecedent. Cobra is a snake that affirms the antecedent. So this is a valid modus ponens. So it means the argument is valid because it follows the correct rule for deductive reasoning, affirming the antecedent. And then it is true because all the premises are true. Then we have valid but unsound. All snakes are reptiles, that's true. Mosquitoes are snakes, that's false. Therefore, mosquitoes are reptiles, that's false. So, first of all, what kind of argument is this? Mosquitoes are snakes. That affirms the
antecedent.
That affirms the antecedent. So it is a modus ponens. It is a modus ponens, and a modus ponens is a valid argument. So it is valid because it follows the correct rule of deductive reasoning, affirming the antecedent, and it is unsound because one of the premises is not true. So there is false information in premise 2, and it entered the conclusion. So the argument is valid, but it is not sound. Then we have both invalid and unsound. All snakes are reptiles, that's true. Mosquitoes are reptiles, that's false. Therefore, mosquitoes are snakes, that's false. Now, what kind of argument is this? Mosquitoes are reptiles. That affirms
the consequent.
Affirms the consequent. So affirming the consequent is invalid. That's a fallacy of affirming the consequent. So the argument is invalid, and it also contains false information. It is invalid and it also contains false information. So it is both invalid and unsound. Is an invalid but sound argument possible? No. An invalid argument is unsound, even if the premises and conclusion are all true. All Ghanaians are Africans. Kofi is an African, therefore Kofi is a Ghanaian. Now Kofi is an African. That affirms the consequent. So it is a fallacy of affirming the consequent. So the argument is invalid and it is also unsound. Now the technicality. Validity is needed for soundness, but soundness is not needed for validity. Something can be valid and it is not sound. But for something to be sound, it also has to be valid as well as true. Some arguments are valid but not true. Now, soundness needs both validity and truth. So that's the end of the class, but there are some exercises. Identify the missing premise in each of the following deductive arguments. Now, these are two deductive arguments. The first one, all military men play football. Bob plays football. There's a missing premise. What is it?
So the second premise, like it didn't identify that Bob is a military man or a footballer, but it just says Bob plays football.
Yeah, so the missing premise would be
Bob is a military.
Yeah, so Bob is a military man. That's the missing premise. All Americans are human beings. All Americans are mammals. What's the missing premise?
All human beings are mammals.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Now answer this correctly. Answer correctly. Which fallacy is committed by the following? All A's are C's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are B's. What is the fallacy?
Fallacy of modus.
Why do you say it's a fallacy of modus?
Because all A's are C's and all B's are also C's. Therefore, all A's will be B's.
Okay, let me put it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Kenyans are Africans, therefore all Ghanaians are Kenyans. What kind of fallacy is that?
Hypothetical.
Yeah, so that's a hypothetical fallacy. Describe the following arguments. All Europeans are not my friends. Ben is not a European, therefore Ben is my friend. What kind of argument is that?
Valid and sound.
No, I mean, what kind of argument in terms of validity?
Europeans are not my friend.
If you want to see the argument more clearly, you can reformulate the first or the major premise. So instead of all Europeans are not my friends, you can say no European is my friend. So you can look at the second argument at the bottom of the slide. No European is my friend. Ben is not a European. Therefore, Ben is my friend. So what kind of argument is that? In terms of validity alone. Now, if you look at it, you see that there are two negatives. There's a negative in the first premise, there's a negative in the second premise. So two negatives will give you positive. So if the second premise is not positive, if the second premise is not negative, it will say Ben is a European. So Ben is a European is what? It affirms the antecedent. So this is an argument that affirms the antecedent. Therefore, it is a valid modus ponens. Okay, so if you didn't do this calculation, you'll be tempted to say it is an argument that denies the antecedent, which is a fallacy. So it doesn't deny the antecedent, it affirms the antecedent because two negatives is a positive. So this is the end of the class. We'll be doing inductive reasoning next week. Any questions before we end the class? If you have a question, you can raise your hand. We address it and then we close. Sylvester.
So I wanted to ask that during examination, can you be asked to state whether it's valid and sound or invalid and unsound? Or
Yes,
you'll be given the okay.
Yes, you can be asked. You can be asked anything we did. So you need to be prepared. One thing I didn't remember is, let me look at the screen again. Watch your lecture videos regularly. Watch different videos on each topic to gain multiple perspectives. So if you watch my video, you can watch the video of another lecturer, then read your textbooks. Sorry, we don't give you the slides, but I'm assuming that by now you've gotten your textbooks from the department. Do all the exercises in your textbooks so that you will not be taken by surprise by the exam questions. So, all right, make sure you read your textbooks thoroughly. Do all the exercises in them. Now, I'm going to leave you to enjoy the rest of your weekend. So we shall meet next week for inductive reasoning on Thursday by the same time. So until then, goodbye and have a nice day.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Have a
Thank you
nice
very
day,
much.
teacher.
All right.